Awesome. Welcome, everybody. This is the ASI Snowboard National Team getting together for just a little Zoom chat and talking about some things and technical conversations and kind of really breaking down some concepts and things that we're thinking about as a team and things that we're definitely thinking about with people that we're working with. And tonight, the topic's actually going to be the idea of the differences between effective and efficient, and those two words and what they mean to us as instructors and coaches and trainers and working with other instructors and working with students that we're teaching and things like that. And so we're going to get into that in just a minute. I'm going to go around the room here in a minute and let the whole team introduce themselves. I am Brian Donovan with the ASI National Team, and let's just go around the room and introduce ourselves.
Chuck Hewitt here out in Colorado.
Matt Larson, I'm in Big Sky. Good to see everyone.
Amy Gan Bailey out of Vermont.
Chris Rogers out of Vail, Colorado.
Lyndsey Stevens out of Vail, Colorado.
And I'll just say that we also have Steph Wilkerson in the house. Steph has a storm rolling in right now and might be going in and out with some connection issues.
Oh.
And then we're also missing a couple of our rad national team coaches. Tony Macri and Eric Rolls are busy being rad doing some other things this evening, so they're not here to join us. But really, I'm going to kick it off here. And again, the idea tonight is just chatting and having a real raw conversation. And these two words that come up a lot when we're training instructors and we're working with people that are going for certification a lot of times, or even when we're working with students. And it's this idea of what's the difference between effective and efficient. And I'll just kind of let the group, if somebody wants to jump up and kind of kick off the conversation, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, just general idea, when I think it's really important, one, and this is why we're here tonight, is to have an idea of what is the difference between the two, because they can look really different when we're riding. What is effective for a certain outcome might look like this, and what's efficient might look completely different, and maybe even end up with a completely different outcome. So like, as we're out there as instructors, we're constantly assessing. Like, when we see some movements from one of our students, we can then ask ourselves those questions like, all right, is this something that's effective for them? Is this efficient for them? And depending on what the student goals are as well, you might go different directions with your feedback.
Yeah, something I often experiences, you start hearing it in the feedback that they might be giving you, like, oh man, my legs are killing me after that run. And then you start to, think about, all right, why are they doing that? Well, I've been telling them to bend their knees a whole bunch, and now they're doing a squat the whole way down the hill, which is not exactly efficient, but it might be effective for not getting bounced around. So that's something that pops up quite often right off the bat is, how can we be more efficient and not get so tired all the time?
I think when we think of effective and efficient, I often hear the term like effective versus efficient, as if like these two things are really button heads and they can't overlap, but I think they can. And I think, we can get something that on a range that's really, really effective, but not efficient at all. And then we can get something that's efficient, but not very effective. So the goal here is to try and bring these two things together and meet in the middle so that we have something that is both effective and efficient.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and say sometimes like there's terrain, say maybe bumps, where the most efficient way to ride bumps might not be super effective, and the most effective way to ride bumps might not be efficient. But there's other times where we're riding where we can be both very effective and very efficient. So like thinking about the terrain we're on, that this concept looks very different. The idea of efficient and effective movements looks very different in moguls than cruising down a green cat track. And I think that's where this, to your point, Lyndsey, like things get really complex, because if we're always striving for efficient movements, there's going to be maybe a performance decrease. Maybe we're not riding as hard. And if we're always striving to ride as high performance, or to ride terrain super effectively, that might not be super efficient. And sometimes that's okay, and sometimes they align really well, and you can learn how to ride terrain as efficiently as you can while being effective in that terrain.
Chris, I love that, because when we talked about this topic, the first thing that went through my head is like, as an instructor or just as a rider, there was a period where I was like seeking out the most effective way to get stuff done. Like as I was getting better at riding, getting on more difficult terrain and riding different parts of the mountain, I was looking at like, what moves do I need that I don't have right now? But then once you start to figure out those moves, then all of a sudden you start working towards like, how do I work as lazily as possible to still get that done? And so then I went past that, like seeking the effective moves, and all of a sudden efficiency became a little bit more like the goal of how do I ride that terrain now that I have the moves and have the ownership of the moves without working and making it really hard and sweaty and tough to ride. Right. And so there was this point where for me, it like almost is seeking out effective riding. And then once you kind of figure out the nuts and bolts of that, the efficiency of how do I do that and make it easier and more fun and more relaxed became like the next seek out thing. And what I'd say is let's take a step back, because we jumped right into it, which I love. But what do these words mean? Like, what do they mean to us? I'm not necessarily looking for what's the dictionary definition, but what do they mean to us when we say effective and efficient, to kind of meet up with Lyndsey's getting away from verses?
I was just going to look up the definitions, but I'm still going to do it. It's going to take me a minute.
Just a thought on what you were just saying, Donovan, with, I've seen plenty of students who are really trying to like muscle the board around. They're trying to force it to turn. We see that a lot in our beginner students. And it's effective, but as Amy was talking about, those movements aren't always efficient. And I think with effective and efficient, like we all go through that phase of, I want to make the board do something. And eventually we learn to go with gravity and, let some of the things happen without having to force it too much.
Lyndsey, I think the immediate example that comes to my mind when we're talking instructors is the idea of fore-aft. I think that instructors, when they start to like hear fore-aft movements for the first time and they start understanding moving along the length of the board, you see that like instructor that all of a sudden is moving their whole body towards the front of the board and then all the way towards the tail of the board. And like, there's these like big moves because they've figured out that does something. And then all of a sudden, like fast forward 3 or 4 years and you see them using really like nuanced versions of those moves. And they're not using these huge, like massive moves to get fore-aft. They're like, I don't have to move that far along the board to get the performance I want. And I think that is like the most obvious, like when I'm talking working with instructors, seeing that idea of like figuring out a concept and using it like with super gross movements and big movements. And then all of a sudden, like refining it back and being like, hang on, I can get that done a whole lot easier with still the same outcome. And so that one to me is like, when we had this topic, it jumped right out of my head is, fore-aft. And I'm guilty. I was training an instructor a couple of years ago. She was going for her level 2. And I was trying to get her to understand the timing of fore-aft. And she stopped and she's like, but you don't do this. And I was like, yeah, I do. And she's like, no, you don't. She's like, you move from like the middle of the board to the tail, but you don't move from the nose to the tail. And I realized that like for me, I had to actually be a lot more obvious with the timing and the motions so that she could see it and understand it. Because I was like, yeah, in this terrain on like a blue run, getting ready for a level 2 cert and training her, I didn't need to like really overemphasize fore-aft. And so she had a really good eye. And she picked up on the fact that my movements were really subtle and it didn't click of what she was trying to do. And so that one always sticks out as like a really good example for an instructor. Larson, what did you find in the dictionary? Or Chuck, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to say you touched on the word timing there, which kind of really jumps into my head. We talk about timing, intensity, and duration, and kind of manipulating those, even within one piece of terrain or one, maybe activity or something you're trying to ride. If you think sort of exam focused, the changing that intensity or the timing of the movement or the duration, I can really kind of toggle it back and forth from being that most efficient movement, right, or trying to achieve this real specific outcome, and in your case maybe really kind of exaggerating that movement to show it to a student or show it to someone training for the exam, versus maybe backing off on that intensity and that duration, which can slide those movements into more that effective world that is taking a little bit less energy and maybe look a little smoother, but maybe not creating quite the same reaction on the board.
Yes, I found some words on the good old Google, and so useful is the word that that jumps out of the Google in relation to effectiveness. Useful, effective, and then efficiency and quality, or how well, is what I found. And I was trying to just put that in my own words in something that's real simplified, condensed. And I think effectiveness for me says performance, or performance of the equipment, and efficiency speaks to body or exertion.
Yeah, I love that, Matt. And tying that and what you were saying, Chuck, in with Lyndsey's point of, we often pit those as efficiency versus effectiveness. That's not a scale, right? The scale would be efficiency to inefficiency and effectiveness to ineffectiveness. And thinking, Tony loves the dials and talking about dialing something up and dialing something down, right? Thinking about those as two separate dials. You can make efficient or inefficient movements for the terrain or the attack at the activity or the task that you're in, and you can make effective or ineffective movements for the terrain or what you're riding, and those being two separate dials, right? We can practice getting ready for bumps by doing dolphin turns in the flats. That's not efficient or particularly effective for the bumps or for the groomer. But when we get in the bumps, that flex and extension movement pattern becomes far more effective. It's still not very efficient. Like the most efficient way to ride the bumps is to go around them, right? We all know that. But if you're actually riding bumps and you're going to use a lot of flex and extension, the effective way to do that is to be less efficient with your movements and to use that energy. You're going to be inefficient in terms of your energy usage to be able to ride those bumps more effectively. So I love that definition. And I think it really helps, to Lyndsey's point, breaking that apart from a effective versus efficient, and into, those are two separate concepts, and we dial them up and down depending on what we're doing.
Yeah, I think something that we all keep talking about too is ownership. And with that, like, we might be trying to get more effective at something, and that, like, where we're using it might not make sense, like the training thing, and becoming more effective or more efficient with things. We have to, like, get to a level of something that now it's part of our bag of tricks and our tool bag that we can use, like, when we need it, rather than using it all the time, like the big 4.5 movement, because you need to gain that ownership of it. You might be using it all the time. It might not be making any sense, but you have to, get that down so that then all of a sudden you can use it when it's actually needed.
I love that word, ownership. And I was thinking to challenge your idea, Rogers, of like the most efficient ways to go around the bumps. Well, maybe it should just straight line them, but then we might have an ownership issue of control.
I meant literally around it, like take the groomer that goes around the next one over from the bumps.
I'm going to jump right in. Chris, I love that you differentiated two different scales. I think that is that is such a key takeaway, is that that inefficiency versus inefficiency working up to efficiency, and effectiveness working down to ineffectiveness. And to Amy's point, I think a lot of times when you kind of put those two scales side by side, sometimes if somebody's really adept and they own the movements really, really well, it's hard to tell where efficiency and inefficiency is happening. Like, they just look really smooth and really lazy, but they have such a refined ownership of the moves that they're doing that they get the maximum performance out of them. Like, I think of effective is like the best way to get something done. And if they can use minimal input and minimal energy to get that done, then sometimes that line is very blurred. And I think that's some of the smoothest, most like fun style to see on the mountain, is when somebody has like really lazy, fluid, smooth style, but gets tons of outcome and performance out of their gear. And they just surprise you all the time with how on it they are. And I think that whole idea of the two different scales side by side that's my personal biggest takeaway so far tonight. That's awesome.
Yeah.
I love that. Been riding bikes a bunch this summer with the kids and doing a little coaching. We talk about fast is smooth and smooth is fast. And it kind of speaks right to that point where And I love it when you kind of find that balance. You have the two dials, right? Your movements are really effective, but also smooth, right? Really efficient. And I think is kind of what I certainly try to strive for when making turns. That's a really cool perspective of it.
Going back to something you said earlier, Brian, thinking about like some of even our earliest movements on a snowboard, and you mentioned this as well, Lyndsey. And we talked several calls back about that very beginner slamming on the, like learning the heel side slip, right? And that's maybe one of the most obvious examples that every instructor has seen of a beginner using very inefficient moves to have an effective outcome. They can stop the snowboard, but their quads are burning after 20 minutes of side slipping and learning how to side slip. And then we learn how to be more efficient, how to use smaller muscles, how to feather that edge and have more control of our stopping. And I think that goes all the way up our scale. I think about like leading an exam, and I'm about to set up an activity where we're going to do some switch, small radius, open carves. We're cruising across a flatter section, getting there, and I'm warming up those movements. I'm making a turn that is very ineffective and very inefficient for the terrain we're on, right? All you need to do on a cat track is tip your body over the board, and it's both effective and efficient. And so making real tight, dynamic or cross under or most flexed edge change using retraction turns on a flat cat track, it's not efficient. You're tiring yourself out, and it's not effective. Or it's effective for making that task, but it's not what you need to do to do that terrain. And so all the way across our scale and kind of all the activities we do, both as instructors teaching and as instructors working through certification, those scales exist, and we're always learning new skills, and we're probably going to be less efficient as we first learn those skills. And then to your point earlier, Brian, as you build skill in that, you can learn to increase your efficiency within that skill.
Yeah, I like how you brought that back to the beginner student idea. It got me thinking about like when with that heel side slip, when something is too effective and you hit the heel side brakes too hard and fall over, and having to go through the process of learning the ownership piece of it that Amy was talking about. I feel like we've all heard the comment from our students where they say, "Oh, you made that look so easy." and then, my response usually to that is, well, it is. We just have to do a little less than what you're doing. We're trying too hard. It's like Kunu from Forgetting Sarah Marshall. You're doing too much. Now you're doing too little. Now you're not doing anything.
Do less.
You have to do something. You're just laying there.
I mean, that's really efficient.
I think that's a really good takeaway for potentially people listening in tonight is with students, we need to be really obvious with what we are showing, right? Like sometimes we have such a refined ownership of the moves that we do to turn a snowboard in the beginner lesson that it looks really easy when that student is like, what is going on? And it's super important that we are really obvious with our demos and what are we actually using, what parts of our body are we using to make the snowboard do stuff. And I think that translates to what we look for in certification exams. When we're talking to instructors, when we're talking riding at exams, a lot of it is, can you demonstrate the moves that you need to show a student? And sometimes at an exam, like when I'm giving feedback to a candidate, it's talking about using the right move at the right time, to Chuck's point, with the right timing and the right intensity and all those things, or not using it with the right timing, intensity, and duration. And at a certain exam, it's about, can you show the right movement with the right intensity on the right terrain, to Chris's point? Are you doing, most flexed short radius skidded turns on that green trail where they're super, that movement doesn't have any purpose? Or are you using that on terrain that actually gets something for you and helps you control your speed and helps you go down safely and things like that? And so the right move with the right timing, intensity, duration is what we're looking for. And it kind of goes back to us teaching, showing our students really obvious movements so they understand what's going on.
I think that's really important to bring up the exam and scenario and what we're doing with AASI certification, that we're really looking for the ability to slide and move around on those two different scales. Can you make those adjustments when it's required? Because you might need to do that for your student. However, if your student is Tony Macri and you want to be solid at dolphin turns on a groomer because that's what's fun to you, there's no right or wrong in that. And so you can, do whatever for the student. And those are different things. And it's our job as great instructors to be able to jump in and out of that.
I love that you guys went there. I was having a same thought earlier about, especially like looking at level 1 skidded turns in a level 1 exam. We separate out the idea of how you ride for yourself and how you ride when you're demoing for a student. And often that we're talking about making less efficient movements to highlight the effectiveness of a movement, right? So as the instructor, we're asking you to show that flex and extension at the initiation of a turn. We're asking you to show that patience initiating a turn. And a lot of times that's not how we necessarily ride when we're out cruising down the mountain, because we're highlighting a movement, which for us at making that demo means showing it less efficiently. And you see that across the national team even. Like, we all ride things very differently. If we're out riding, none of us look the same snowboarding. We're all riding at a very high level, but there's so much room for personal style and for body types and shapes and how we move different muscles. And I think that's part of the beauty of this, is like the way I remember filming with Eric Rolls years ago on one of the Matrix videos, and his line through the bumps was like this real flowy, like border cross move, and I took more of like a zipper line, like straight down the fall line in the bumps. And they both look like very high-end riding. They both look efficient. They both look effective, but they don't look anything like each other. Like those two paths through the bumps look very different. And so, I hope in this talk about effective versus efficient, it's not sounding like we're trying to drive people to one specific outcome. There's so many different ways to move, and sometimes you're going to choose more efficient ways. Sometimes you're going to choose more effective ways or ineffective ways based on what you're doing. But that has nothing to do. There's like a third. I mean, there's many other dials, as we've learned from Tony, but some of those dials are style and personal preference and line choice, and there's all sorts of other dials. So, keeping in mind, we're just talking about these two, effective and efficient.
Chris, I think that's the best public service announcement. I think that, I know this crew all buys into that, and that's one of my favorite things about snowboarding in our culture, is that we are really behind the idea there's no right way to do it necessarily, or there's not one right way to do it. And we're not looking for that one perfect model all the time. We want people to have their own style and their own inspiration when they're snowboarding. But there's certain movements that are effective to show to students. And when we're going through certification, a lot of times when we're reeling it back and asking for specifics, that's what we're looking for. Can you show a very specific move on terrain to help a student understand it if they really process information visually? But when we're riding, I love being inspired by seeing a ton of people ride their own way all over the mountain. Like that is the core of snowboarding. I hope that never goes away.
I started thinking about the two scales again, and thinking about like the DJ mixing board that Larson had out earlier that he was messing around with. But like, it's almost like if we're around here, we have like this safety zone of moving around with effective and efficient. And then as we start to slide those scales further apart, there can be a higher chance of one overcoming the other. Like when you're too effective and fall over and you're on the ground, or I think a Euro carve is a really good example of this, where you're trying to create something very effective, but if you let the efficiency slide too far away, and the effectiveness is just going to go through the roof, and we're going to end up on the ground.
Well, I think that's the perfect example of like when I see Rogers go by me in this like super extended laid out toe edge Euro carve, where his like chest is like hovering above the snow, and I see like 8 people following him trying to do it, and it's just a bunch of people sliding down the mountain on their bellies, and there's like a very fine difference between that, like, holy crap, oh my god, I'm about to get taken out by a person avalanche, and yeah, very, very minute difference between really owned performance and striving for that level of ownership.
Yeah, that definitely goes back to the ownership piece of, if you're trying for that effectiveness and you haven't quite mastered the efficiency of it, could end up with some over effectiveness.
Billy slides.
Cool. Well, we're as a team, we're going to have a bunch of these fireside chats, these Zoom talks where we just get together and kind of break down concepts. This one, if anybody has anything else you want to add, we can definitely add in some final thoughts or a final summary. But I think this is a really cool conversation. There's so much more to unpack to this conversation, and a lot of that is going to be on snow. Riding with trainers or riding with other instructors or friends, whoever it is, go out and try to find the lines of meshing these two scales and really ramping up efficiency and really ramping up effectiveness, and maybe isolating them and then maybe seeing where they kind of come together. So any final thoughts from the crew tonight?
Yeah, I just love these words, effective and efficient, as great replacements for, say, right and wrong. And I think we've been talking about that a little bit tonight, but it's just really great when you're having those conversations with your students to have some different language to use when they come to you and they're asking, did I do it right? And they're just like, how do I snowboard? Am I snowboarding right? And like, you get to do this how you want to do this. And if we can talk about and figure out what your goals are, I can help you get there. But as far as right or wrong goes, we want you to have fun.
Speaking of fun, you guys remember National Academy?
Yeah.
Pretty fun.
Should do that again sometime.
Yeah, maybe at the end of this next season.
Perfect. Lyndsey, why don't you tell us, what is this National Academy thing?
National Academy is our end of season snow nerd conference where we all get together, National Academy and Rider Rally up in Big Sky. And it is a full week of clinics and hanging out, having a great time with our fellow snowboarders and fellow PSIA members. Love to see you guys all there.
I think I'd add that it's a full week of clinics and snowboarding very inefficiently at times. And I keep going back to like those dials for effective and efficient. And I think we limit ourselves by just including those two dials, and including a performance dial helps make a lot of sense if we think about effective, efficient, and performance of riding. Because I know for myself, like getting from point A to point B, I'm really focused on that efficiency dial, so that when I want to turn down the efficiency and turn up the performance, I'm ready to ride at a higher level performance. And I love where this conversation's going, and having some thoughts about effective and efficient riding. And our goal should not always be to ride efficiently. I think we're doing a disservice in our instructor community if we're always striving for efficiency. And sometimes we should strive to be inefficient. And a lot of the fun things that we do in snowboarding is when we're being inefficient. There was nothing efficient about riding a week of POW at Big Sky. Like, we were all exhausted at the end. Our legs were tired. Like, we were riding inefficiently because we were having too much fun.
Yeah, the more efficient that we ride, eventually I'm going to get bored.
Boom.
And nobody wants to see a board Amy.
Mm-mm.
Cool. Well, I think that wraps it up for tonight. Thank you for being here with the ASI Snowboard National Team. Continue to check out these Zoom, fireside chats, these tech talks, whatever you want to call them. We're going to keep pumping them out, and we hope you're getting good information. Come ride with this team, because we're excited to be on snow and expand these concepts and see what you guys bring and what you've thought about on these and what you can add to this conversation. So stay tuned, keep checking out, and we're looking forward to the next one.
You.